Okay, welcome everybody for our weekly seminar series. Today we are very much honored to host Professor Axel Timmermann. Axel is a German climate physicist and oceanographer with an interest in climate dynamics, human migration, dynamical systems analysis, ice sheet modeling in sea level. He served as co-author of the IPCC third assessment report of the United Nations and a lead author of the IPCC fifth assessment report. His research has been cited over 18,000 times and has an 18 disclosed 70. Actually, checked which is 90 already. And in 2017, he became a distinguished professor at Pusan National University and founding director of the Institute for Basic Science Center for Climate Physics. In December 2018, the center began to utilize a 1.4 kilo X 50 supercomputer named Alex for climate physics research. He received a bachelor in physics and master in theoretical physics in 1992 and 1995 respectively from the University of Marburg in Germany. He worked as a research assistant for several years at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology before completing a PhD in meteorology in 1999 at the University of Hamburg. Professor Timmermann worked as a postdoctoral fellow in the Netherlands and Hawaii before becoming a principal PI at the DMG research group at the Institute of Medicine in Kyiv. In 2004, he moved to Hawaii and worked as an associate professor and later full professor in the Department of Oceanography, School of Ocean and Earth Sciences and Technology at the University of Hawaii. And in 2017, he relocated to Pusan, South Korea, and headed the new IBS Center for Climate Physics in Pusan University. With this 3 years, we are very honored for hosting him here. I just want to mention that in case of an alarm, we will continue in the topic record. So, Axel, the podium is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for the invitation. Okay, so I would like to talk about past climate and its impact on human evolution. And this is work we've conducted over the last 5 to 8 years with a team of colleagues, partly from University of Zurich in Switzerland, University Federico II from in Milano, sorry, in Napoli, and also colleagues from my center, the IBS Center for Climate Physics, and also colleagues from the University College of London. Okay, let's see. All right. So I first wanted to say a few words about our center, the IBS Center for Climate Physics at Pusan National University in Busan in South Korea. So we're not in Seoul. We are at the southeastern point of South Korea. Very beautiful beaches here, mountains. It's a fantastic area. I started the center in 2017, and we have in the first year purchased one of South Korea's fastest supercomputers that Nicolas just mentioned, and that has been the workhorse for a lot of research in our center, both paleoclimate research, but also future climate change projections. And over the last 5 years, we also built up an isotope geochemistry lab to analyze stalagmites from all over the world, from Botswana, Armenia, China, of course, South Korea, even Greenland, to reconstruct past climate change. And over the last 8 years, our institute had about 100 members from 17 different countries, and currently we have 54 on staff and from 12 different countries. Systems. And we have a group that looks at past and future climate sensitivity. Okay, so let's start with the main talk. Little introduction here. Like in an opera, we start with a curtain opening up and with a overture. And first, we're going to get introduced to our main protagonists of the presentation today. And these are essentially our human or hominin ancestors. Of course, currently it's us, Homo sapiens. But there was a time when several hominins actually coexisted. Neanderthalensis, which is Neanderthals, of course, Heidelbergensis, Erectus, Homo ergaster, and Homo habilis. These are pretty rough categories. There are more species or subspecies that I could discuss, but for the time being, let's just focus on these 6 main ones because that helps a little bit to structure and better understand how past climate influenced human evolution. Okay, and the interesting thing is, everything experienced, all of these human species experience various types of climate changes, sometimes the glacial, interglacial cycles, which are very large, but also very slow, but also very abrupt climate change, such as volcanic eruptions, for instance, the Toba eruption that occurred 74,000 years. So if you like, climate is kind of the conductor. It plays the music for this, for the protagonists, and they have to essentially adapt in some way to the music. So now, of course, all of these species have disappeared, and we are the only remaining hominin species on our planet. Okay, to put this all into context, when did these different human species live? We start off essentially with the birth of our surviving Pleistocene. Homo heidelbergensis is another one, a very important species that we'll talk about, Neanderthalensis and Heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens. And of course, these last 3 species, they experienced very large changes in the climate system, glacial, interglacial cycles, full amplitude after the mid-Pleistocene transition. So for them, they had to adjust to much larger climatic changes in some way. And we are going to talk about how they actually managed to adapt to these different climatic conditions. Interestingly, what we also see is with the evolution, of course, of our genus, Homo, the brain capacity increased quite substantially, all the way from 500 cubic centimeters to maybe 1,300 cubic centimeters. And what was most important is the changes in the shape and the structure of our brain, in particular the build up, a strengthening of the prefrontal cortex, which is a key, let's say, CPU programming unit of our brain. And that kind of started maybe around 500 to 600,000 years ago, that this became a bit more pronounced and indicating maybe also a higher level of social ability and cultural abilities. And we can see that very clearly in the changes, of course, of the tools. There are different tool technologies, very rough shaped tools from the Oldovan period. Acheulean was much more refined. We see then later on in the Middle Stone Age also the shapes get much more sophisticated, many more tool processes, manufacturing processes have to be applied to create these very sophisticated stone tools. And all of this is kind of the context of what we're going to talk about. Climate has changed, and also humans have changed in many different ways. The question then arises, of course, is climate to blame, or would it happen even with constant climate conditions? Here is another view on this tree of our human genus, and some people call it the tree of life, tree of evolution. For me, it's more a tree of evolutionary dead ends, because except Homo sapiens, everybody is gone on that tree. So let's start here on the right-hand side with our own group, and the main clades, and I'm just looking here at mitochondrial DNA clades. They're all labeled as L groups. And we, essentially all of us living together on this planet, share a common ancestor around 200 to 300,000 years ago. Somewhere in Africa, there is still a bit about a debate about whether there was a single origin or multiple origins. But clearly Africa is the birthplace of our human species, Homo sapiens. Then most likely, and we're going to talk about this, we emerged from a group called Homo heidelbergensis that had a sister clade in Europe and Eurasia, Neanderthalensis and also Denisovans. And we're going to talk about two main bottlenecks. One bottleneck is B2, which is an interesting one that was recently proposed. Using DNA data, some geneticists suggested that around 900,000 years ago, at the time of the mid-Pleistocene transition, our human species had a very close shave, almost disappeared from our planet. And we're going to look into this a little bit more closely. It's also interesting that at the same time, our human species or ancestors had a merger of two chromosomes. So chromosome 2A and 2B became the chromosome 2. So that has changed our entire DNA, of course. And then we're going to talk about another bottleneck, B1, which occurred around 1.126 million years ago, where Homo erectus, a very successful species, almost became extinct from Eurasia, and there we think we are quite certain that climate can be made can take the blame. All right. So if we look at the Eurasian species, we can see the predominant biomes that they like were maybe a temperate forest, a little bit boreal forest, still savanna grassland. Then in Africa, you can see the dominant biomes that these early human species really thrived in were very different from the Eurasian ones. And we can see grassland and dry shrubland was really a key biome under that helped humans actually to develop. Okay, so we can ask some basic questions. Did past climate influence human habitats? That's quite easy. We're going to talk about habitat modeling. Did it actually influence how we adapted to climatic stress? Was climate also driver for selection? If there are different groups around, who survives? Is climate really the selective agent there? Speciation related to that question, migration or dispersal, genetic diversity, or if you put everything together, evolution. And these are very big questions. And of course, none of these questions is new. Even Charles Darwin has speculated about some of these questions already before. But the point here is we don't want to speculate. We really want to use quantitative data and also statistical and actually explicit modeling tools to quantify if the contributions of climate to these different evolutionary processes. Okay, so for those of you who are interested in this type of research, we addressed some of these questions in earlier studies. In the last 8 years, we had 3 Nature papers and 3 Science papers that addressed different aspects of this climate human influence. And we first want to address maybe some basic questions. So if we try to combine human species information with climatic information, first of all, we want to ask who actually, which species. If I have a skull in my hand, or if an archaeologist digs up something, they want to know, first of all, which clade, which lineage does it really belong to. Okay, this is work for the anthropologists and archaeologists to determine that. Then where did they live? Well, that's quite clear. Wherever people are successful in digging up human artifacts or even human fossils. So we have a who and where. We need to know a when. So if we lift up, let's say, a stone tool or a fossil bone, it's really crucial to determine how old is it, because then only then can we try to look into climatic data from the time period to determine what were the climatic conditions at that time. And that is usually done with different methods, of course, stratigraphic methods, but also uranium series dating, radiocarbon dating for everything younger than 50,000 years. So there are different types of methods, or OSL dating. They're all very important because they put, let's say, a skull or a bone into a temporal context, and that temporal context we can then link to climatic data. So then the question is, what was the climate like at that time, at that location? So I'm going to explain a little bit more how we get this information. But first, let me say a few words about computer models, so climate models. So there is a little bit of misconception sometimes in the community that a climate model is just like a statistical model. You put in some observations and it extrapolates something into the future. Nothing can be further from the truth. So a climate model is nothing else but a computer code that solves the complicated physical equations of the climate system. Like a weather forecast model does it for the atmosphere, a climate model does it for the atmosphere as well as for the ocean and land processes, sometimes vegetation, sometimes marine biogeochemistry, etc. So if we think about the physical equations, what do we need? Well, we need fluid dynamics for the atmosphere and the ocean, quite clear. Thermodynamics, energy exchange. Quantum mechanics is really crucial. We tend to forget this. Why is quantum mechanics crucial? Because the greenhouse effect is quantum mechanical effect. So without quantum mechanics, the long wave radiation would not be absorbed by molecules such as CO2 or methane. So quantum mechanics is not explicitly resolved, but the main information from quantum mechanics is used in the radiation code, and that's where we simulate essentially the exchange of radiation in the atmosphere through equations of electromagnetism. So these are kind of the main ingredients, and the equations are complicated. So it would take maybe 1 or 2 years to go through all of them and explain them well in classes for graduate students. But I just wanted to give you an overall picture here what's going on. Okay, there are also processes that are not explicitly resolved. For instance, a climate model does not resolve how individual humans burn fossil fuels. So this is introduced as a forcing into the system. So the past changes in greenhouse gas concentrations are a forcing, for instance, or land use change. Then we have empirical parameterization. So clouds cannot be very well simulated because they come from little cloud droplets, and of course we cannot simulate every cloud droplet in the entire world. So we have to capture the essence of their physical processes, and this is called a parameterization. Of vegetation is another good example. So now these equations are so complicated, people work on those equations for 30, 40 years. They code them up. Usually it's an entire research institute doing this. And in the end, you end up with about 1 million lines of typically still Fortran computer code. And they're so complicated that you can only solve them on the fastest supercomputers on our planet. Okay, so here you can see the computer that we purchased in 2018. So it can do 1.5 quadrillion calculations per second, and that allows us to really simulate the climate system, solve these complicated equations in great detail. So here you can see the installation of the computer as it is brought into the headquarters of our center, and everything needs to be hooked up. So it's essentially like not just one rack, it's not one server or many different servers, but all of the servers are connected essentially to operate like one big brain. So this is something to keep in mind. The whole thing is able to solve very, very large memory problems very quickly. Okay, and now what we did is in order to address the what climate was like, we have several possibilities. One possibility is we go to a place where we found a human artifact or fossil, and we try to reconstruct the climate from that period. But unfortunately, not all of the archaeological data come with very good quantifiable climate information attached to that. So for that, we use actually a climate computer model to simulate the past climate system. What do we need for that? Well, we have a climate model, which in our case is the community Earth system model. And as I said, a complicated model, but we need to apply certain types of forcing. So processes that the model itself does not fully capture, but that it still experiences as boundary conditions. So here, what we need are the greenhouse gas concentrations for, in our case, we will conduct a 3 million year simulation. So we need the greenhouse gas concentrations for the last 3 million years. And most of it is observations from ice cores to 800,000 years ago. And prior to that, we use a model that has been tested against paleoclimate data. Okay, then we need information from, we need information on the ice sheets. Again, our Earth system model does not include the ice sheets. So we take the data from another Earth system model that actually runs very quickly and that is able to simulate the ice sheet dynamics. And then what is really crucial is that we also have the main Milankovitch cycles included, the changes in Earth axis tilt, the changes in Earth's axis, Earth's orbit eccentricity, and the precession, which is a combination of several different factors, but you can just call it Earth axis wobble. So we apply these forcings to this climate model and we run it for 3 million years, covering the time period of the last 3 million years. That took about 1 year on our entire supercomputer, just to give you an idea. So it's kind of one of the longest climate model simulations conducted to date. Okay, so the key point here is we want to know, because we don't have the real paleo proxy data at every site where we have human artifacts. So we need to check actually if at the sites where we have good paleoclimate data, this model is actually doing a good job. And later on, we are going to talk about the different types of models, human models that we can run, that we can use climate data to force these human models with that. Okay, what you see here is just an overview. Focus on the red and the blue lines, and the red lines are kind of proxy data that are sensitive to hydroclimate, so rainfall changes or aridity changes. And the blue line is the model, and the red line is a paleoclimate reconstruction, let's say a sediment core or stalagmite. And you can see basically much of this variability, and this is for the corresponding sites. Much of this variability is nicely reproduced, in particular the strong precessional cycle in rainfall in the tropics, all captured nicely. Then here on the right-hand side, you can see temperature reconstructions from various sediment cores in red and the climate model in blue. And also there, the correlation is very high. Not only the correlation, but also the amplitude matches very well. So none of these paleoclimate data has been actually used to drive the model or anything like this. So this is just a completely independent test. Okay, let's say a few, and we've done more tests. If you're interested, take a look at our published studies. Okay, now big question is, well, the climate system we can simulate, we have the physical equations. How can we simulate human? That sounds pretty adventurous and bold. Okay, there are three main modeling strategies. One are biogeographic models. People also call them environmental niche models, where essentially we use archaeological data, time and location, and we look at the time and location in a climate model or climate proxy database. What was temperature like, rainfall, maybe the net primary productivity as an indicator of food resources. Sorry, let me just turn on the light here. And so this is pretty standard ecological modeling tools. And then there are reaction diffusion partial differential equations. So they're also called Kolmogorov equations. And they typically look at the density at a grid point, how that changes human density or the biomass density, let's say kilograms humans per square kilometer could be a unit. And what we have there is usually a logistic term, so growth, but also a limitation because the food resources are limited. And then we have a dispersal term simulated here as a diffusion. And so I just let them run. So here you can get an idea. This essentially simulates how humans are spreading into different regions over the last 120,000 years. And then we're also using agent-based models. So think about it as a computer game. We are simulating actual human individuals, of course, in the computer, not in situ, in silico. So male and female, they're running around, they're looking for food. They will mate, they will be born, they will die, and so on. So this is essentially a real computer game. And what we do in this kind of computer game is we are tracking individuals and how they respond to the changes in their food availability. So that's where climate comes in, because climate determines how much food is available. Think about an arid region, let's say 200,000 years ago, it may have had very little resources, food resources, compared to a much wetter region. Okay, that's all captured by this magic quantity called the carrying capacity, and we come back to that. Okay, let's say a few words about this habitat suitability or environmental niche modeling, species distribution modeling. There are many different words for that, but the idea is quite simple. So let's just look here at Homo heidelbergensis, our ancestor species, mother species, if you like. And what we have is, let's say, a location where they were found. And at that location, we have an estimate, maybe from a climate model, about what the climate conditions at that time were. Let's call them climate condition 1 and 2, but we can use higher dimensional space for that. And that essentially builds the kind of the ecosystem. But then we project this habitat essentially just irrespective of the information on where they were found, we just project it onto the climatic space and get essentially a species distribution model. So this is just the projection here. And then we can use different tools to estimate a higher dimensional probability distribution from these data clouds. And in our case, we use a simple method, but very robust, called the Mahalanobis distance. Okay, so this way we will get an estimate of the likelihood to be in a certain area. Is it very likely that humans existed in this climatic space, not in the geographic space, but the climatic one? And that one we can essentially call the climatic niche, the habitat suitability, or essentially it's a probability distribution. Okay, and then because climatic conditions themselves change over time and space, maybe from our climate model, we can put this information on the changing climatic conditions into this estimate of the probability distribution and calculate a time and spatially varying habitat suitability. Okay, how does it look like? Let me just give you an example here. There is this very important question on who was our mother species, essentially. And here we have Southern Africa, or Central Eastern Africa. And around the time of our own kind of speciation, 200 to 300,000 years ago, there were some interesting groups around. So we have a famous fossil, Homo kibish, around 200,000 years old. That is maybe the first real kind of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Then we have evidence for something maybe a bit of a hybrid, has a lot of similarities to this guy, but not 100%. That's maybe 260,000 years ago. And 300,000 years ago, we have this Heidelbergensis, which still has big eyebrows, and so on. So it looks quite different, but also has lots of similarities. So this is kind of prime time when mother species turns into daughter species. And it can happen in various locations, as I said, at the same time. But what we can do is we can say if or when the speciation took place, the mother species and the daughter species, they should have a similar habitat suitability in the same region. So that's kind of a simple condition to determine something what we call the area of origin. And there could be many areas of origin in Africa, for instance, but we can quantify the habitat suitability as a function of time with this method I mentioned earlier on for two different species. Let's say Homo sapiens, and you can see, well, they like this area in Southern Africa quite a lot. So pretty high values here, but not all the time. Sometimes it was actually very close to zero. And what you're seeing is already the Milankovitch forcing, the changes in astronomical conditions impacting the food resources and hence also the habitat suitability. And then the Heidelbergensis species kind of has the same swing, but of course they lived much earlier, started to emerge around maybe 900,000 years ago. So the fact that we have such a close match in the habitat suitability between these species means potentially this could have been an area of origin of our own species. So we can test this for different areas. Eastern Africa has been used very often as kind of the cradle of humankind. That one actually I didn't plot here, but it has a much lower overlap in the habitat. We can look at other regions. It turns out Southern Africa has this perfect overlap between mother and daughter species habitat. So immediately looking at these habitat changes, which we estimate from a large collection of fossil data that we link with paleoclimatic data from our climate model simulations, we can estimate important questions regarding human speciation. Okay, we can do this also for other species. We can ask the question, well, where did Neanderthals in Europe come from? And there we can also find immediately there was a clade of Heidelbergensis in Europe that most likely transferred in a pretty gradual way into Neanderthalensis. It was not like a major speciation event, but more a gradual transition. And I mentioned also Southern Africa as a potential place of emergence for Homo sapiens around that time, 200, 300,000 years ago. But of course, Homo sapiens spread from there, and also Heidelbergensis lived somewhere else. But the only point where they seem to have this contact between mother and daughter species climatic preferences is in Southern Africa. Okay, let's talk about this. That was all introduction, but let's talk about this depopulation event in Europe. And maybe, Nicholas, you can just let me know when I'm running out of time.
Problem.
Okay, so depopulation of Europe, 1.126 million years ago. A group called Homo erectus kind of disappeared, and a different group occurred or emerged maybe 400,000 years later, and this is called Homo antecessor. So if we look at the Homo erectus fossils and also tools that were found over the last, well, let's say this is 2.2 million years to 800,000 years ago, we can see, well, the first ones are here in this region, Georgia and Ukraine as well. And then they spread into Central Europe. But then essentially it looks like there is a gap. Could be that people haven't found the right, haven't looked at the right place, something like this. It's not very clear, but in any case, that has been the discussion so far, that there may have been a hiatus. In particular, this group and the subsequent group, they were very different in terms of their technological skills, and we don't know what actually happened here in between. So we looked at this from a climatic point of view and found something quite remarkable. So if we look at the ice volume changes, so this is benthic delta 18O from a marine sediment core. These are all the glacial periods, interglacial periods, the usual thing. We go from the early Pleistocene through the mid-Pleistocene transition. And there is the very first cold glacial period with a massive ice sheet over Northern America and Eurasia is marine isotope stage 22. And looks like these guys didn't bother much about this very cold conditions. But so there is nothing that really sticks out as a main event that could have driven a hiatus in human population. So that's kind of mysterious. But actually, there is new evidence from a site, a marine sediment core called also the Shackleton site. And this marine sediment core is very nicely layered and has a huge amount of data that my colleagues in the UK have analyzed for many years. And in particular, they looked at the pollen stored inside here. The pollen, essentially, they come from the Iberian Peninsula. They are being washed there through rivers, but also through winds. And then there we can also extract long-chain organic compounds from this marine sediment core that are produced by marine algae. So the compounds are called alkinones, and they're being formed by coccolithophores. So looking at the length or the amount of long and shorter chained organic molecules, we can essentially calculate an ocean temperature, and there are calibrations for that, how to do that. Turns out these coccolithophores produce a different amount of shorter ones and longer ones for colder and warmer temperatures. Okay, so using these data, we can now look into an interesting climatic evolution. Here we are at 1.2 million years ago, 1.1. And what we see is, well, actually, there is a massive climatic cooling event. So if we look at the temperature drops very rapidly by about 10 degrees Celsius. And think about it, we are not even in a large glacial period yet. The first big glacial period came much later, around 900,000 years ago. So there is something massive happening around this time period, 1.126 million years. We also see that the pollen, which are more temperate pollen, they quickly turn into steppe pollen. So there is a major change in the vegetation. And there is also some indication that there was a freshwater input into this North Atlantic. So we built, using all the data from the Homo erectus that we have, we built a model of the environmental preferences. We looked at the temperature and the food availability, let's call it carrying capacity or net primary productivity in this case. And so this two-dimensional or actually a higher dimensional space is essentially tells us which were the dominant climatic preferences for this group. And how did the real climate system deviate from these preferences when this millennial scale event occurred? And it turns out in this habitat suitability space, the change from very likely conditions, I will show the green curve here. This is habitat suitability, very beneficial conditions, to essentially almost impossible to live conditions occurred very rapidly as the temperatures cooled down. So we ran a climate model essentially with this idea that there was a major freshwater pulse, maybe from a smaller Eurasian ice sheet, but very massive. And the result was put into this habitat suitability model for Homo erectus. And we can see that the habitat suitability, the environmental, let's say, quality of Central and Southern Europe deteriorated dramatically. So this could have really led to massive depopulation of this Homo erectus group. So that gives us some idea. And in fact, now if we put these data from the climate model into this context, what we see is actually this millennial scale event that I mentioned earlier on, very massive, very strong cooling occurring here. And that seems to fit more to this idea that there was a hiatus. albeit the first big, large cooling event after the mid-Pleistocene transition was actually much later. Okay, so this is what we really need to look at, this terminal stadial event. Okay, now we're going to talk about the second bottleneck for a while. And this is a fascinating one. We are again looking at this group Homo heidelbergensis. And I mentioned already at that time, around 900,000 years ago, there was a change in the climate system. The glacial amplitudes became much stronger. There was also change in our human DNA, or the chromosome structure, this chromosome merger. And after this event, also our brain capacity, the prefrontal cortex structure, they changed very much, as well as all the culture and so on. So you can say after the mid-Pleistocene transition, the genus Homo was much more sophisticated than prior to that. Okay, so what really happened here? So there was a paper in Science 2023 where some Chinese colleagues, Hu et al., argued using present-day DNA data, if they trace that back, there must have been this massive bottleneck. Prior to that, humans were very healthy, and then something happens here, and they're very unhealthy, almost disappear, and then they kind of recover. Well, they argue that a severe bottleneck occurred between 930 and 813,000 years ago, most likely due to climatic changes. Well, it's interesting, this word most likely, because they provide zero evidence for that. So we thought, this is interesting. Let's test this, if climate can really create such a large genetic bottleneck. And we did this by running I mentioned computer game. It's called an agent-based model, where males and females are running around looking for food, looking for mates, raising their children and everything. And all of the individuals over the last 2 million years that we simulate, they have a genetic tag. So we can really check their hereditary information. And again, well, why are they interested in climate, or how are they affected by climate, is because they need something to eat. The food comes essentially from the net primal productivity of the land. In a desert, there is very little food. In a rainforest, there is a lot of food, but it's not very easily accessible. So we need to account for some weighting. Again, the habitat suitability model is perfect for that. And everything is then driven again with this large paleoclimate computer model simulation that we ran on our supercomputer Aleph, as I mentioned earlier. We also have a biome model, vegetation model, that also provides better estimates of the available food resources. Okay, let's see how that goes. So this on the left-hand side here is a little movie. So we seed this population around 1.9 million years ago, at locations where actually these are fossils and artifacts, where actually during that time period, early humans, Homo ergaster in particular, lived. Let's see how that goes. So this is now the density, but in reality, we simulate millions and millions of individuals over time here, over millions of years. So, but we're just clustering them. And what you can see is now, okay, there was a big change. So prior to that, we have 4 or maybe even 5 different subpopulations. And then after this massive climate event, we end up with kind of one big subpopulation and a small population down in Mandela Bay, Southern Africa. And every once in a while, they spread into the Kalahari region and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a model simulation that documents that this climatic change of the mid-Pleistocene transition, larger changes in the interglacial amplitude, changes in the food availability, actually influenced subpopulations across Africa. Because we have different subpopulations, they can also build their own genetic kind of identity, and we are creating diversity as we have this subpopulation. But if everything collapses and we only have one population left, in that particular case, we have a collapse also of the genetic diversity. Okay, so here on the right-hand side, you can see essentially the population size. In certain regions, it collapses quickly. Here in the Eastern African region, it's really very stable. It remains, yeah, like a refugium. Okay, we have these births later on. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. Okay, now for this model simulation here, you can see the temperature. This is kind of the collapse in the effective population size or the genetic diversity. And clearly, yes, our model does not know anything about real DNA. It simulates in silico DNA. And just in response to the climate system, we have this collapse, the human genetic bottleneck. But interestingly, in the population size, global population size, there is not that much of a change. Actually, the change in genetic diversity is due to the collapse of the subpopulations. And then we have these births here later on, also interglacial periods with the right cultural evolution. We allow a little bit these individuals to grow culture. This means they can recover, actually. Also, different subpopulations can recover, disappear again during glacial periods, and so on. So we have kind of a breathing, glacial, interglacial breathing of the entire human genetic diversity. Okay, so I think I kind of discussed the most important things. These recoveries from the extinctions are happening mostly in Southern Africa. And these are like these spikes where from a small refugium down at the ocean, they spread into the Kalahari Desert, which at certain times during the interglacial periods is not a desert, but a savanna, so they can move out very quickly. Okay, so this is, I'll just, by the way, this whole thing is actually consistent with observational data. So if we plot the density of observations, artifacts, or fossils, we can also see that this is not very well figured. It's a bit confusing. So this is the latitude. We can see that at the time of this transition, also the human evidence that we have for evidence for human presence kind of disappears at the same time as the model. So in gray shading, you have the real model simulations from these individual humans, and these are the archaeological data. You think there is maybe something going on. Okay, so I will maybe skip the last part. We can do this for constant temperature, constant rainfall, constant net primary productivity to see which of these climatic drivers is the main let's say, culprit for this human genetic bottleneck. And it turns out is mostly temperature, and the net primary productivity is actually not directly precipitation. And that is interesting. Now, we can run this even further. So we allow humans to grow culture in a constrained way, which is actually constrained also by archaeological data. And if you have questions, I can explain that a bit more in detail. We are essentially scaling a parameter, the carrying capacity in the model, with the complexity that was observed in stone tools. Over time, they became more complex, and that could be an indication for higher culture or cultural carrying capacity. And what we see then is that, again, we have more of these recoveries occurring, and we have an overall population growth over time into the late Pleistocene. So this gives us some idea. So let me just summarize this part. So think about the mid-Pleistocene transition, major change in the climate system. Prior to that, we have small glacial cycles. After that, we have the big glacial cycles. And so it turns out there is also before and after for humans. Before MPT, humans or human species were regional dwellers. They hung out in Africa mostly. They had a very narrow climate niche, very specialized, and so on. And then something happened, also the chromosome merger. And then afterwards, human species became global wanderers, fire makers. They were able to control fire, advanced tool makers. They grew their prefrontal cortex, everything, all the elements that were necessary to really create kind of the preconditioning to who we have become right now. So next steps, I won't go into the details here, but rather than just simulating humans, we have now built a computer model that simulates 2,700 mammal species on our planet, as well as all the interactions, competition, predation, and so on and so forth. And it's running right now. So this is just an example here of a glacial period. You can see whatever the density, biomass of mammut, but you can pick any animal, mammal that you're interested in. And here you can see the changes of biodiversity, species diversity over time. So this is a wonderful tool now to not only address humans, but to look at the entire system from a more, let's say, holistic point of view. And we can also use this model into the future using also future climate forcings and land use changes. So just to summarize, we started off kind of with the Milankovitch forcing, astronomical changes. They drive changes in our climate system, rainfall changes, for instance, vegetation changes, animals change. In short, food resources for humans, carrying capacity, which is kind of the same as saying the carrying capacity changes. That led to changes in dispersal, as we saw, changes and adaptation. We didn't discuss this in detail. Survival, well, that's a good one. But speciation, we also saw an example, this speciation, Homo sapiens, origin, Homo heidelbergensis. The question, is there an area where these groups were actually likely transitioning? And of course, all of this kind of contributed to cultural development. In a simple way, cultural development, of course, contributed to us being more capable of hunting or extracting food resources. But we also started to do land use change, right? Cutting down forests and so on. So that's kind of the beginning of the Anthropocene, where you can really see the human agency. But also cultural development now has gone to such a crazy level that we are exploiting, that we are digressing, that we are going far beyond our planetary boundaries when it comes to climate, habitability, nutrients, and so on and so forth, air pollution. So this is another concept, but the overall concept is climate played a role in triggering adaptation in humans, but that adaptation also helped us develop better tools, and these better tools helped us to extract more resources. So you have this positive feedback between tool development and resource exploitation. And that kind of is the human agency that hopefully is not going to be our demise. So I'll stop here just to say a last word. This is a really fascinating field. We just had a conference last October. Lots of people came from all over the world trying to figure out together how we can use climatic data to inform archaeology, anthropology, and even paleogenetics. And it's a really quickly growing field and a wonderful field for early career researchers also to embark on. Okay, so I'll thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Axel. It's very enlightening for us. I open the podium for the people to ask questions.
Okay, maybe I will ask. Yeah, thank you very much for very interesting lecture. I'm Regina Katzman. A question is, as I understood, Homo sapiens, they migrated to the north from Africa, mostly due to the climate changes, if I understand correctly this. But the Neanderthals, they migrated a bit to the south, but not further to the south, right? So, and then my question is, till which, like, let's tell, boundaries they migrated, and if that was also climate change driven, this stop.
Yeah. So the dispersal out of Africa happened many, many times for our genus Homo. You could see already Homo erectus 2 million years ago made it out of Africa. But then there were many, many different periods. But for Homo sapiens, we likely had three main out of Africa events. Maybe the first one starting in the Eemian around 125,000 years ago. Then another one maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe 80,000 years, and then clearly around 50,000 years ago. Now, what happened during these earlier ones, 125, 100, and maybe 80, was that we had a green Sahara. So we had so much rainfall because the northern hemisphere summer was closer to the sun. The northern hemisphere heated up, and also there was more moisture. And that means more rainfall created savanna-like conditions in the Arabian Peninsula, northeastern Africa, and so on and so forth. So this is a migration corridor, and just following a migration corridor not only for humans, but also for many mammals, their prey, that humans were hunting. So they probably didn't realize that they went into another continent following some giraffes through, I don't know, through the Sinai or so. So this is the availability of food is creating green corridors for Homo sapiens. And then Homo sapiens, they encountered a very different environment being in Eurasia, first of all. They couldn't migrate north immediately because they couldn't, they had to first down-regulate their cell melanin level in order to be able to create vitamin D in their bodies. So let's call it humans had to first become that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Axel. May I ask a question as well, or a couple of questions?
Please go ahead.
One thing that impressed me in the models is the high fidelity signal that seems to appear in your model, and this is something that is normally very hard to generate because, like when we look at events, when we look at climatic events, they are stepping. The events are not continuous. Yet models, it's very difficult to generate such things in model. How do you manage to insert the high fidelity signal into your models?
You mean high frequency?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay, so there are several aspects to that question. One is that we have the orbital changes, the astronomical changes, time scales 20,000 years and longer, but then the higher frequency is due to the fact that the human climatic niche is actually confined, right? So there is a certain boundary below which humans cannot exist, right? So the human sensitivity to climate is quite nonlinear. So if we have small changes, slow changes in the orbital forcing applied to a pretty steep step function in the human sensitivity, then we can generate something that's that is a bit more abrupt. And that together with the internal noise in the agent-based model, humans just disappearing randomly, right? We have to run these models many times in order to get good statistics. That creates something that looks like a more high-frequency signal. The model does not include Dansgaard-Oeschger events, millennial scale events. I had a paper earlier on where I looked at the Dansgaard-Oeschger events as well. But in my case right now, I think it's the combination of internal stochasticity in the human system and the very strong nonlinear response of humans to these climatic changes in both directions, right? It can't go to warm, it can't go to cold. So there is actually this Goldilocks zone for human preferences.
But the climate changes, basically what you're saying is that you are smoothing the steps in climatic changes. Like, you know, if you look at the going out of LGM, we have the meltwater pulses, for example, which were very significant events. And yet you're saying the models do not represent them. They just give thresholds for the human interaction.
Right. So in this particular model simulation that I presented here, we don't have the meltwater pulses included, Heinrich 1 or Younger Dryas and so on, because the model does not have an ice sheet explicitly dynamically connected. We use the ice sheet forcing, right? There's a big white mountain for the atmosphere, and that changes over time, but it doesn't flush fresh water automatically into the system. So that means the climatic forcing that we have is smoother on millennial and centennial timescales than reality. However, in the human response, we can still see higher frequency changes because of the combination of human stochasticity, because, well, there is a random number determining, okay, individual 1025, you're dead right now, go out. So this is, and there's nonlinearity in that sensitivity.
I have another, thank you. That's interesting. And it still works. The interesting thing is that it still works. The other question is, do you integrate into the models the changes in land areas associated with the and the changes in character of this land? Because the land coming out of glacial, you know, going into glacial times, the lands, the coastal areas are very normally very, or let's say more productive than land subsequent.
So to some extent, yes. So what the human models see, and I only showed a few examples, but we have more. What the human models see is a change in the bathymetry, of course, because sea level goes up and down. So the coastline changes. Otherwise, they wouldn't get over to the Americas. Otherwise, they would have difficulties getting to do the island hopping into Australia and so on. So that's fully accounted for, the sea level effect on the coastline. Then, of course, let's say under present day conditions, you have, let's say, a submerged region, and under glacial conditions, it becomes land. So what kind of vegetation type do we put on land? For that, we actually run a vegetation model that determines, okay, this is kind of the climatic condition. So the most likely vegetation in that area would be, I don't know, rainforest or something like this. So a vegetation model takes care of the coastal zones to determine what kind of resources could be available there. So, and of course, the ice sheets themselves, there are landscape changes. What else do we have? We don't have river changes or the formation of large lakes. That might be one of the issues.
Okay, thank you.
You Axel, more questions? Well, actually, I have plenty, but we don't have enough time. But I will ask.
Yeah, Nicholas, I just wanted to say that I didn't say it from the beginning, but it is a very impressive talk. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. I have questions basically concerning, first of all, if you could potentially use the supercomputer for modeling the Pliocene, which is probably the best equivalent for the present climate change and future warming. I know that there is the future modeling aspect of that, but I don't know if you are involved in that as well. And how do you do to actually implement new data that is all the time coming? You show over there Lake Van, you didn't show the Dead Sea. I know the Dead Sea has plus and minus, but there is the ICDP of Lake Chala and so on. It is a very good comment. So how do you do that? So two questions.
So I had a hard time understanding your audio. It was a bit muffled. So I understood something about Dead Sea, Lake Chala, sorry, or Lake.
Yeah. So how do you do to implement those data into the model? Because the data is coming up all the time, right?
Yeah, okay. Right. So none of these data goes into the model, of course. The model runs independently, but then afterwards, we just look at the data from the climate model. Okay, these are all zeros and ones, but we can tell them, okay, go to this grid point, like Lake Chala or Lake Lizan, and tell us what the rainfall at that grid point would have been in the past. And then we can determine whether Lake Luzerne was likely large during glacial conditions because of reduced glacial evaporation, right? Cooler temperatures, or whether it was large because there was more precipitation, right? So we can really determine not only it works, we can reproduce these changes, but also we can determine in the climate model what are the physical reasons why something happens. And so we have done pretty extensive paleoclimate model comparisons and so on, but there is much more in the pipeline. We're looking right now at changes in the biosphere, trying to validate them with pollen data and so on and so forth. So depends really on your favorite region, on your favorite proxy and so on. But the climate model, if we can generate physical changes on the grid points of interest that we can directly compare with the proxy time series.
I mean, the second question was about the Pliocene.
The Pliocene.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I also missed that a little bit acoustically.
So my question was, if you do the same kind of modeling on the Pliocene, which basically the best, let's say, I mean, it's contested, right? But it's like the last long period of time in which we had high CO2 and high temperatures, which could be the future. So, but I mean, the more you go to the past, the less records you have in the paleo. So it's tricky a little bit. How do you do with that?
So one of the biggest uncertainties is, of course, the CO2 curve. We have good data all the way to 800,000 years when the Antarctic ice core stopped. And prior to that, we have not very continuous time series and quite some large uncertainties. So originally, the plan was to use actually proxy data for the CO2 and also, but the uncertainty is large. In particular, if you go into the Pliocene, was it more like 250 or was it more like 450 ppm and so on? Sorry, not 250, 350 or 450 ppm. So that makes a big difference. So what we did is we used another Earth system model for that, which was previously published, or we used data from another Earth system model previously published. And this is a Climber model. It's much faster. Our model is comprehensive. It's slow. So for us to run 3 million years took 1 year. For them to run 3 million years takes about a day or 2 days, right? So they can run many different computer models and see for what parameters in the fully coupled climate carbon cycle system can they reproduce the ice core changes in CO2. And then they use these parameters to essentially determine what would the CO2 changes be from the Pliocene into the Pleistocene. So this is, I think, a model-based data set, but it works well because CO2 leaves an imprint in the climate system and it changes the temperature. So by using their CO2 forcing, we can then compare the simulated temperatures at proxy locations and see if they really match our simulation. And they do quite well, actually. So, but yeah, Pliocene, the starting point is something, of course, with much higher uncertainty than if we go into the late Pleistocene, for sure.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Well, I have more questions, but definitely we are much long in time inside after the deadline. So really, we really appreciate your willingness to talk to us, give a lecture in virtual. We hope that the situation will manage soon here, so we could have you in person.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That's very kind of you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.